So, Leslie, we have spoken together on stages all over the world. We have, I can't imagine just how many mediums of communication on radio broadcasts, in music recording studios and sound booths, book writing together, podcasts together. We just so many different mediums of communication, and yet we have never done what we're doing right now.
Yeah, it's kind of fun to do something different and unique. We don't have a script. We don't have anything clearly planned. We have an idea what we want to share with you and share with each other, but yeah, it's going to be fun.
So we have this unique split screen type of video look. There's a reason for that. It's a little strange when you're married to someone and then it looks like you're, in two different parts of the world talking to each other. Technically, we're in the same room. And so it'd probably be good for all of you to at least know that we're in the same room. But the reason we're doing it this way, and this has been actually a challenge for quite a few years for Leslie and I to actually do discussions together, because that's like what we used to always do. We did it all over the world. But do you want to explain, Les, or do you want me to try?
Well, it's actually really hard for me to look sideways at someone for a long period of time. My neck starts to hurt. And I don't know when that started, but it was a number of years ago. And it just became harder and harder to look sideways. But then if I don't look sideways, I look like I'm not listening to you and I look like I'm bored. So we try to avoid that situation if we can. And I remember being on stage together speaking back in the day. And that was always really challenging because if one of us waxed long, the other one would just have to awkwardly stand there and either stare at the person.
There's nothing worse than having a yawn start to, so move its way through your system. It's like because everyone's watching you.
Yeah.
Listen to the other person.
Yeah, how you respond to the other person. So you're very aware of how you're standing. And I would get okay, my neck hurts or this isn't comfortable.
That's probably where you got some of your neck
it's probably
problems.
what caused it. But I remember that clearly and having to really figure that out. Okay, where do I look? If I look at the audience while he's talking, then that looks weird. But if I look at him, it gets, my back starts to hurt, whatever. Yeah. But those were the days. We don't really have that problem as much anymore because we're not usually on stage together. If we are, it's for a short time. So this way that we're filming this is it's kind of like a Zoom call. Yeah. So we can still talk to each other, but we don't have to look sideways at each other.
So though it is a little odd for a married couple to do it this way, at least we're getting something out, because we literally cannot do this in any of the other models we have. Nathan and I can stand together, sit in chairs together and talk, and we don't have any issue. But you and I have had a tough time just getting this set up.
I think it would work for 5 or 10 minutes, but I don't think either one of us are really great at keeping things super short. So I don't think it would be 5 or 10 minutes. So here we are.
And I think the whole purpose of a discussion like this is to not have that 5 to 10 minutes limit, which says, Leslie's going to turn into a pumpkin or her neck's going to start hurting in 5 to 10 minutes. So hurry up, Eric. And so I think that's part of the special thing about what we're trying to do here. This is somewhat of experimental type of discussion, just like I'm doing with Nathan. If anyone has heard our series that began a couple weeks ago called Citizenship, we're trying to cultivate more of a long-form discussion model. We don't just sit around and listen to long-form podcasts, so it's not like we're trying to mimic something as much as attempting to do what I think is very powerful in and through that medium, which is unscripted, unedited, more of the natural, dig a little deeper into the human side, say things maybe in a less polished fashion that gives more of the authentic aspects of, for us, the Christian life, our marriage, our family. So this is new to us. We haven't done this. We're used to speaking to an audience and teaching, training, preaching, whatever you would call it. And so this is a unique discussion where it's actually with Leslie and me. We're talking together and you can listen in. And our series that we're wanting to unpack over the upcoming weeks is called 30 Years. We just celebrated our 30-year anniversary.
That's kind of hard to believe. It actually, whenever people tell me things like, I read your book when I was 10 and now I'm 25 and have 4 kids, that makes me feel extremely old and dated. But 30 years
and now they could actually say, because I think our first book came out, we wrote it in 1995. So they could actually be saying, yeah, I was 10 and now I'm like 39 or 40.
Yeah. Or they could have been like a baby
Yeah.
when we
And
wrote our
now they're
first
like
book.
married with 4 kids.
Yeah. So we've been around for a while, and the books have been around for a while.
And we have a lot of life lived. And so much of our ministry now, I would say it's a great gift. All of this life lived. A lot of it has challenge. A lot of it is tremendous difficulties that we have walked through in standing for truth in a generation that seemed to be repulsing it. But at the same time, it's given us such a beautiful and amazing life together. And so as we walk through this, we sort of wanted to unpack some of the different dimensions of these past 30 years, maybe things we've never actually written about, talked about. And so to explore that's a little different for us. And to do it with a live mic is definitely unusual for us. To do it with a split screen video, unusual for us. I like all of that. I think you and I both love doing things in a new way, a unique way. That's what Ellerslie is. It's taking on the system and reforming it and saying, hey, let's try something new. So let's go back to a very specific moment in our life. And I think both of us remember it well. In fact, it's so vivid and clear in my memory. I could tell you exactly where we were. And it was in Longmont, Colorado. We were in our car. I don't remember which car we were in, so I can't say that. Maybe it was our Camry, but I don't remember the car. I remember where I was. I remember I was driving, and I remember looking sideways, and there was Leslie in the passenger seat, and there was a house, through the window. And so I remember the moment well. I don't know if we were coming back from a meeting we were trying to get counsel from Christian leaders at that time that we knew, and they were speaking into our life, and we really didn't want to mess things up. Whatever God was doing, we'd moved back to Colorado so that I could go to med school. I think you were planning on nursing school still at the time. And
I think we had a vision to become medical missionaries. So
Yep.
the idea was to get medical training, go somewhere overseas and be missionaries. And so now all these opportunities were hitting us, speak on relationships, share your story with young adults, and specifically on the topic of purity, romance, and relationships, pre-marriage relationships. So it's very, very different than the vision that we had for our lives at the
we
time.
were excited about the medical vision. I would say, and this is giving somewhat of our punchline away, but we were not excited about this speaking and talking about purity and relationships vision. But this leader had just told us our first book had come out, but we weren't trying to like release a book. That wasn't really our goal. What we had done when we were first married, our love story, and this is going to sound maybe a little hyperbolized when I first say it, but it shocked the world. It was so unusual to people that it caused everyone to ask questions, and everyone wanted to know. We were being invited onto radio. We were being asked to speak at schools. We were being asked, for interviews. Everyone wanted us to share our story. Now, maybe this is odd, but I had never heard of people sharing their love stories. I'd never asked someone to share their love story. I didn't know that was something you did. And so it felt like somewhat of a violation when people were asking for our love story. In fact, it bothered me. And I probably made that clear to Leslie. It's like, what's wrong with these people? Why does everyone want to hear about our love story? It's our love story. And could we just keep it private? So we're being asked nonstop about that. So we finally just wrote it down. And we took, what was it? 2 weeks?
2 or 3 weeks. Yeah.
And we wrote this little short booklet. It was 100 pages. And we printed it. And the next person that was going to ask, we were going to sort of hit them in the face with it and just say, just read. We're not going to talk about it. You can just read this. So then someone that we knew came across this booklet, was impacted by it, who worked at a publisher, who then, well, I think it was a secretary to a publisher, and set it on the publisher's desk. And the next thing you know, we had, this is probably before email, this is dates and stuff. I don't remember how they communicated. Maybe it was a phone call. And the question was something like, would you allow me to publish this? This needs to go around the world. And we're thinking, you have got to be kidding. We cannot get away from this. So we had just encountered this leader who had said, I think you guys could go full time into this. This is that hot People want to hear this. Eric and Leslie, I just want you guys to seriously consider this. I think you could travel the world and go full time into this thing of speaking and communicating on this topic. So that's when our moment arrives. I said, okay, Les, do you think we should go full time into this?
Yeah, and I remember thinking immediately, like, no way. In fact, that's what I said, was no way. It wasn't just like, no, not really. It was like a no way, emphatic. I think mainly because, first and foremost, it was different than the vision I had for where we were headed. And second of all, the only people I knew that spoke on that topic, relationships and purity, were really, really weird. I don't know any other way to say it. Like I didn't want to be like them. I just felt like they were like weird. So they were kind of.
I think one of our jokes was that you speak on relationships and how everyone should be pure and wait if you can't get married yourself.
Yeah, it was just, yeah,
it
just
in that dimension of your life, you make everyone else miserable.
Yeah, it felt the other people I had heard speak on this, it just felt very oppressive, very legalistic, very rules focused, and totally not romantic or
and that's back in the early
beautiful.
90s. So it's not saying a specific person. It's a long time ago. And
there were quite a few different people. They were always kind of in these kind of weird subcultures though of Christianity. And weird may sound like a harsh word, but that's at the time, that's how I saw it. And I wanted nothing to do with it. I didn't want to be one of those people, didn't want to be labeled that way. So it was very, very resistant to the idea.
I think we need to say, granted, we were rather young in our perspective and we weren't processing this through well. Neither of us wanted to do this. And so I think part of the irony of how God is going to lead us in our life. First of all, we really do desire, and did back then, desire to follow Jesus. We desire to be led by the Spirit of God and not by our own desires, our own emotions. And so even though our emotions were screaming, you have got to be kidding, I think that's part of the profundity of our story is that we did surrender and we did say, okay, Lord, I don't know if you actually want us to do this, but if you did, we're open. We're willing. Change our heart, change our mindset towards this.
I think the turning point for me was that first speaking event that we went to. It was right around the same time that this publisher was asking us about publishing our book.
It was the end of 1996.
And so we'd only been married a couple of years, maybe a year and a half at that point. And they asked us to come speak to this youth group. And the reason was because these kids in the youth group had gotten a hold of our little booklet of our love story and they were passing it all around. They thought it was really fascinating. And I don't know if they were fascinated in a like shock and horror kind of way, like how could you not kiss until your wedding day, or if it was like they really were interested. But they asked us to come and share our story to this youth group. It was actually not just a youth group though, it was like 700 teenagers at this mega church. And so we really had no idea what we were doing. I wasn't really that comfortable speaking in front of people at that point. I think you were a little more than me, but I don't think we really knew what we were doing.
It was uncomfortable for both of us. We didn't even know how to dress. I mean, if you're in a church and you're
supposed to dress up.
So I think I wore a suit.
No, you didn't wear a suit. I think you wore a tie though.
Okay.
It was like you were kind of like definitely 10 notches above where everybody else was in the dress department as far as formality. And so we definitely didn't know what we were doing. And we didn't really know how to communicate because we didn't want to just get up there and share our love story and give these teenagers this idea that they have to do everything exactly like we did. Yeah. So we did spend some time. I remember spending it like a long weekend and just trying to look at what God had done in our relationship and break it down into key core biblical principles that would apply across the board to everyone's life, everyone's situation, so that our love story didn't become like a pattern or a formula for them. We could just extract those biblical principles and lessons that we had learned. So that's really what we shared over those 2 nights that we were speaking to this group. And I remember very clearly the entire time sharing, not feeling like they appreciated anything we had to say. I feel like they were being challenged to say, wow, if these biblical principles are true, that means I might need to make some changes in how I'm living in this area. And most of these kids they had their boyfriend, girlfriend with them. They were like kind of, draped around the other person as they were listening. So the idea
didn't seem like it was translated.
The idea that they would maybe want to let God into the center of this area of their lives. Some of them knew that meant they weren't in a healthy relationship. They needed to step back, or they needed to put God first above a romantic relationship. Those kinds of principles, they didn't seem to be receiving it. And I just wanted to get out of there. But the second night, I remember we just felt like it went on forever, and these kids don't want to hear this. And at the very end, the way we finished was I went to the piano and I was kind of playing some background music, and you were giving like the closing challenge. And it really wasn't just a message about relationships. It became a message about surrendering everything to Jesus Christ, letting him be the Lord of your life. And what does that mean? That means laying everything on the altar, including this area of romance and relationships. They had never heard a message like that before. And I looked up from playing the piano. As I was playing, I was just like, let's get this done. They're not going to respond. Let's just, you're waxing really long here. This is what's going through my head. Like, I want to get out of here. I want to go to bed. This is done. But I remember looking out and seeing, and I almost like fell off the piano bench because I couldn't believe it. But all over this auditorium, these young people were on their faces. They were weeping. They were giving this area of their life, every area of their lives, to Christ. And it was so powerful to see how God used it, in spite of the fact that we were not seasoned speakers. We really didn't know what we were doing. We were just speaking clear truth to them. And they had never really heard that before. They were used to a very watered down kind of truth, I think. They got, the shallow version of Christianity, because especially back then in that youth culture, mindset, young people can't handle deep truth. So it was like pizza parties and movie nights and all this kind of stuff, and a little bit of
speak longer. What was it, like 20 minutes?
15 minutes, yeah. I think was the normal limit of any kind of teaching.
And we just spent 2 straight nights of like 2.5 hours.
So it really hit them hard. And one of the girls I remember came up to me at the end and said, we've never heard anyone speak so straight to us before, and we're hungry for this. We were just waiting for someone to raise the standard and say, you can have something better. God has something better for you, and we're ready to receive that. Mm-hmm. And that was so powerful to me. And it was such a shock to me, like, wow, this generation actually does need this message, and they do want to hear this, and they're waiting for someone to speak this. And I think especially because we were only a few years older than them. So I think they did have a lot of respect for us, especially we had just gotten married and had just walked through all of this. So it was very fresh for us. And that became the message that we shared every time we went and spoke. And that changed my heart, because I saw how powerfully God was using it. And I began to realize this is actually something God's leading us into. And it's very different than these, quote, weird relationship speakers. It was very different than what I had in my head it was going to be. And it was exciting and powerful to see the changes that these young people were walking through, and just how they were being challenged, not just in the area of purity. So I think that is a misconception, that for us, I thought if we spoke on purity, that's all we could speak on. But we began to realize that the only way purity can even work in anybody's life is if Jesus Christ is in his rightful place. So we always brought it back to that place of surrender everything to him. Let him be in total control of your life. That was really the core of our message, and still is 30 years later.
Yeah. I don't know if I told you this, but when we're working out on Mondays with, I'm driving Kip and Harper down to Gun Barrel, Colorado, which is where that church was. Mm-hmm. And so when I'm driving by it, I think I was telling them, I don't know if I told them the story of our first event there, but I was like, Mom and I spoke in that church. And so it's unique to just have that brush against such a 30-year, well, I guess that was probably more like 28 and a half years ago, but just unique when you get that fresh brush against your soul of those key moments, those defining moments in our life.
Yeah, it's really amazing what started in that building. I do remember thinking back to our wedding. We had a lot of different godly older men pray over us during our wedding ceremony. And I remember one of them prayed that our story, or the principles, the truths that God had worked in our relationship, would go all around the world. And I didn't think much about that prayer. It just sounded kind of like a dramatic, enthusiastic prayer. But at that time, we didn't have a platform. We didn't intend to go into any kind of communications ministry. So it wasn't a prayer I thought much about. But then what God started that night in that church building was a message that did go all around the world. So it's pretty amazing to see how God wove that together even when we weren't expecting it.
So if we were to just sort of skip along the water of our ministry instead of diving deep into that, because I think we can take some upcoming times conversations where we can dive a little deeper into some of the granular aspects of starting ministry, moving forward in ministry, the dynamics of ministry. But we're going to be invited all over the world, and we're going to be traveling to different countries, speaking, and it's a very unique season in our life because this isn't what we expected to do. We're going to say yes to it, but we still thought it was for a very short season. And that season is going to stretch on and on and on. We, I think, in our early 20s had upwards of like 10 to 12 books on relationships that we're going to crank out. And they're very popular. We had bestseller books in there. And we have this platform we didn't expect to have. And so that's just a foundation. We're speaking on something that at the time was hitting a nail on the head. It was such a dynamic match of like something God did in us and then something that was happening in the world. It just kindled something so unique. And the hunger, the response we had, almost every single place we went, I would say the youth leaders of that environment said, we've never seen these kids respond to anything until you guys came to town. It was just some amazing thing that was happening.
I think up until that point in the Christian culture, the way pre-marriage relationships were being approached was very much like the way everybody else does it. You know, you date around, you get in these shallow flings, you get your heart broken a few times, and then finally you hopefully meet the one, and, you know, hopefully you haven't had too much emotional baggage that you're bringing into your marriage relationship. But it was very hollow and empty. A lot of people were being hurt by it and didn't ever realize there was a different way or a better way to approach this area. So when we begin to share these principles of God actually has an interest in this area of your life, and if you're fully submitted to him and surrendered to him, he wants to be in charge of this area. He has a purpose for this area of your life. And also the concept of honoring your future spouse in not just physical purity, because physical purity had always been like the emphasis for me growing up. I think for you growing up in Christian circles, it's like, here's the line, don't cross it. And everything else, the guarding the heart, guarding the mind, any type of being set apart for the person you're one day going to marry wasn't really talked about at all. And so really there were a lot of misconceptions and wrong ideas of what purity was. It just felt like this line in the sand, just don't cross this line. It either seemed to lead to legalism, because people wanted to make all these rules to make sure you were living in purity, or it led to this very casual, sloppy attitude like, well, as long as I don't cross the line, you know, there's all that gray territory that's just free game. And I know that's the way I lived, that's the way you lived, and it brought a lot of pain and heartache into our lives. So we would always share the story of how we personally, individually walked through a time of awakening to the fact that we were not honoring God, even though we were doing it the Christian way. We were not honoring God in our pre-marriage relationships. This is long before we met each other, but we would share that part of our story and how God walked us through that process of repentance and surrender, and also beginning to love our future spouse before we knew who that person was and what that meant. It was guarding our thought life, guarding our heart, our emotions, and not just saying like, how close to the line can I get, but how far can I go to please God, to honor my spouse, and just how when you follow God's pattern, it does lead to true fulfillment. And it's a better way. God doesn't need to imitate the way the world builds a relationship. He's got his own way. And yet we were always very guarded about making the things we were sharing into a formula, because people they either love or hate formulas. Either if you're more prone to like, you know, give me the rule book, give me like the step-by-step plan that I can follow so I know I'm okay. They're very drawn to formulas and rules. And we really wanted to avoid that because God is a very creative God.
Formulas stink. They are the worst thing. They sound great at the beginning and they give a false illusion of pending success.
So we always wanted to emphasize it's about a relationship with Jesus Christ, and it's about a relationship with your future spouse if God's plan for you is marriage. And if it doesn't flow out of love for your relation for Jesus Christ and for your future spouse, then it's just empty and hollow and it's just a bunch of rules. And I remember publishers and other people who kind of were around us at that time really wanted us to get these labels to what we were, they wanted us to call it this and have like this formula to it.
There were three key words at the time. So we had dating, that was one of our options. And we knew that it would be inappropriate to call what we did and what we talked about dating, because dating, first of all, I thought it sounded like a fruit. And
for most people at that time, it meant like these really shallow, physical
get to know
relationships.
Someone physically to see if you're compatible with them. Yeah. And then, so we were like, that doesn't match what we're talking about. Then you had a word courtship, which was not an attractive word to both of us, but it has sort of an old-fashioned meaning of romance and falling in love with someone. And yet it started to take on a formulaic thing. So we actually began to shy away from ever even touching the word, lest we be associated with a formula. And then there was another one called betrothal. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, that was on the scene for a while, a few years.
It's a biblical term. It's like a Hebrew
I'm actually
term.
not sure what it really was referring to. I think people just use it because it sounded really spiritual. Like, this is what we're doing. We're betrothing.
Yeah, it also was very unattractive.
Yeah, I was very turned off by the courtship, betrothal, those terminologies. And there really was a subculture in parts of the church at that time that were very strong on making this a legalistic thing. And you are never allowed to do this. You always have to do this as do's and don'ts. And I think the reason that our message did resonate so deeply with the people we spoke to was that it was not a formula. It was not based on rules. It was all about a relationship with Jesus Christ. And it did raise a standard. It did call them to something more, but it was out of love for him, love for your future spouse. And it wasn't a step-by-step, do this and don't do that. It was a beautiful picture of God's pattern. And it was just leading them into a closer relationship with Christ. I think at the core of our message, it always was let God have his way. Whether that means a lifetime of singleness, whether that means his timing and the way he wants to build a relationship, let him have his way. And that's where the whole idea of when God writes your love story came from. And we didn't want to call it anything that sounded like a formula. We wanted to really give that vision of this is an outflow of your relationship with him. He cares about this area of your life. And it was actually a very simple message, but they were very hungry for it because they were fed up with the kind of shallow, let's just date around and give our heart to one person after the next. They knew there had to be a better way, but they didn't want this formula rules-based thing over here. And so we were providing that healthy biblical balance. And not that we were, said or did everything perfectly at the time, but that was just where God had us. He had kind of opened our eyes to see these are the principles and the truths from Scripture that I want this generation to understand. And that's what we were articulating.
So let's sort of segue from that and fast forward our life, our marriage, our ministry. I don't know how many years, but it's somewhere around 2017, 2018. I actually don't know what year it was, but we had moved past this particular message, which I never knew if that would even happen. For a while, it was like, dear Lord, could we talk about something else?
It felt like it was probably about 8 or 10 years in the beginning that we just were always being asked to speak on relationships, purity, guy-girl relationships. And so
that's what the publishers wanted us to write on, too.
Wrote so many books on it. And finally, we were just feeling like, there's a lot more we are now burdened to share with today's Christians. And so I know I began to write books for young women, and you wrote some books for young men, and we had branched out from there. And then over the years, it was really a blessing because our launch into Christian ministry, the fact that it was so successful, the fact that we did have best-selling books, it gave us the ability to branch out and say, okay, what is God putting on our heart to share? And we already had this audience and this platform. And so we began to share about the deeper Christian life and the true gospel and what being all in for Jesus looks like. And that grew into really focus on a discipleship ministry, which I'm sure we'll talk about in future
and that was,
episodes.
I think 2009 is when we acquired the campus. and began to transition into our Ellerslie years, if that's a way to describe it.
But we had been touring and speaking to really large crowds for so long. And we really had the desire now to go deeper with people and maybe take a smaller group and really help root them and ground them in truth, because we had grown so much deeper ourselves through all of those years of ministry. And we realized there's so much more that we want these Christians to have besides just a weekend worth of material. So God led us to a campus, and we began to disciple groups of like 100 people at a time. And that felt, to a lot of people, it felt like a step back, because we had been speaking to these thousands and thousands of people. But for us, we knew it was exactly what God had called us to. And also it was very deeply fulfilling to see the people we were ministering to be able to go so deep in truth and spend weeks with them versus a few hours with them. And so that's kind of where we were when this topic of purity came back on the scene for us. And by that time we had 6 kids, and it wasn't really, it was definitely not a focal point.
It's sort of like we'd retired from the topic.
I think some people, even sometimes when people come to Ellerslie, because we are so well known for the book When God Writes Your Love Story, they think we just talk about this topic all the time, and
I think we avoid talking.
We do avoid it because we did it for so long, and it's not that we're against the topic, but we just we moved on. So the fact that it came back into our life a few years ago was a little odd, because we're like, wow, we haven't really focused on this for a long time.
So some of the dynamics that are taking place is Joshua Harris, who had been another contemporary voice back in the 90s. I still remember him interviewing us for his New Attitude magazine. I remember us traveling through Oregon, staying in his office overnight, going out to a Starbucks with him, having discussions, and him asking us if we thought it'd be a good idea if he published a book. I mean, so it's just like this unique background we'd had with Josh, and we'd always been friends and just co-laborers. And I began to hear these statements and these rumors about Josh not doing so well, especially when I heard that he was beginning to sort of deconstruct what was now being called the purity movement. And then I heard that he was going on an apology tour. Do you remember that? When he was going on an apology tour to actually say, I was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken on this. It's harmed so many people to be, proclaiming all these thoughts and truths about.
And I think why he was gaining kind of a following or success through that, there have been over the years people who have come out of very legalistic backgrounds, and purity was communicated to them in the wrong way. It was not a biblical way. It was a very oppressive way. And then they heard him talking like, all these ideas of like purity and living God's way and all these things has just harmed these people. And those were the people that were like, yes, I've been harmed by this because, I was told I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that. And I lived under this restriction and this oppression. And now look at me, I'm 25 and I'm still single. And it's all because of this, message. And really the people who were jumping on the bandwagon had come out of situations where they hadn't really received a true biblical understanding of purity. They had received a legalistic, human-built understanding of purity, but that's kind of who Josh was appealing to with his apology tour.
Well, and it was a hard thing for us, first of all, to hear that from someone who has taken a strong stand for Jesus, then to see them sort of go on a meltdown in their own faith, and ultimately to not just forsake his relationship with Christ, but his marriage that had flown out of this testimony. Very difficult for many. And there's probably some of those that are listening that remember that vividly. But what's interesting is it was sort of like this very challenging moment for us where I felt like so many people started pinging us on this, like, what are you going to say about this? Because everything we had stood for back in the 90s, everything that we had represented was suddenly being called into question by this church system that had sort of gone rogue. And it is like a movement, almost a zeitgeist within the church itself. And
I think it was really just taking the whole idea of purity and throwing it under the bus. It's like, this is a
The whole
bad,
thing is bad.
you're not allowed to say the word purity. This is like evil. It's caused damage and that kind of thing. I don't really think anybody that I knew of, I mean, I didn't pay a lot of attention, but people weren't necessarily throwing us on the under the bus or accusing us of anything. But it was kind of like, you were a voice on purity all those years ago. Do you have anything to say in response to this big to-do that's happening out there?
Very difficult, because actually we didn't want to talk about purity. And we sort of actually thought, this is just to be honest, that God, if he had called us to do this, and then he was calling us to focus elsewhere, that he was going to raise someone else up to fill the void. And I don't know exactly how to, if you were to say, did he? I'm not exactly sure if someone just didn't take the call or what, or, you could say, Eric and Leslie, maybe you were supposed to stay in that. And I don't know that that's true either. It's just, it's an odd thing for us. But when it came to this exact situation, I still remember the wrestling. Leslie and I talking, it's just like, you've got to be kidding. I feel like I'm supposed to say something. And because when there are seasons in history where truth becomes incorrect in society's eyes, and where the world wants to cancel anyone who takes certain stands and espouses certain ideas. And this is one of them. So this is, I don't know, 2018. I'm guessing at the year. I don't actually remember when it was. And to stand for purity and to actually step out and say, hey, by the way, I actually believe that this purity, thing that harmed so many of you is actually still right. It would sound and translate terribly. But we felt we were supposed to speak. And that's going to be a defining moment in our life. I think we were thinking of naming this particular discussion that we have unapologetic. It'd be fascinating, Les, do you want to comment on the fact, we wrote a lot on this. We spoke a lot on this. Do we have something to apologize for in what we shared?
No, I don't think either one of us regret anything we ever said or stood for in this area. And that's saying a lot after 30 years and however many books. Now, I do think we could say it better now. Absolutely. We have had so much more life experience. We've gone deeper in biblical truth. So there's things that we could articulate more clearly or more deeply, bring more scripture in or whatever. We're better writers. We're better communicators. I mean, I think back to that very first youth event, and I have no idea how we came across, but we're very seasoned now in what we do, and we've gone very deep in our spiritual understanding. So yes, we could say it better, but at the same time, back then we had the advantage of being young, only being a few years older than the audience we were speaking to, having just walked through this ourselves. So that was a huge plus, as opposed to this age, trying to speak on it. Yes, we could articulate it better, but we may not be in the right season of life really to be the front runner speakers on this. And so, but as far as apologizing for the principles we stood for, what we communicated, absolutely not. I don't look back with regret and I don't sit there and go, oh, that's embarrassing. Why did we ever say that? And that really brings us back to those core biblical principles. We so shied away from formulas and labels and do this and don't do that. And therefore, what we stood for were just simply biblical principles. And you can't apologize for biblical truth. I mean, purity, the word purity may fall off the popularity rating in the church, but it was God's idea. And purity, according to the biblical pattern, isn't oppressive. It's actually beautiful.
That's right.
And I think there were a lot of misunderstandings. If people have come out of a legalistic, oppressive subculture of Christianity, they might associate purity with some very human, very legalistic, very non-biblical ideas. But purity, according to the biblical pattern, is simply honoring God with your heart, mind, soul, and body, putting him first in this area of your life. And if his plan for you is marriage, truly honoring your spouse and not making it this shallow thing like don't cross this line. And, there's been people have said, well, there was this idea of like a purity prosperity gospel. If you live this way, you'll have this fairy tale love story. In actuality, we did emphasize that God's ways are beautiful. But the reality is that God's ways are beautiful whether you're single or married.
Yep.
It doesn't matter. It's not like a romantic happily ever after. When you have Jesus at the center of your life, whether he calls you to a prison cell, whether he calls you to the mission field as a single person your whole life, and you're living, in the backwoods and you don't really ever see hardly any, no one your own age, or whatever odd calling you might have that you look at and you think, oh, I could never do that. When Jesus is at the center of your life is fulfilling and beautiful in a way that you could never experience if you hold the control of your life. And that was always the gist of our message. So yes, we emphasize God's ways are beautiful, but it was certainly never hey, make a bargain with God. You follow this pattern and he'll give you this. That's not what purity is. The core of our message always has been surrender. Give everything to him. Let him have his way. That's what leads to fulfillment. And so there have been some kind of wrong ideas that I wouldn't say any of it was really directed towards us, but about purity in general, or about the purity movement that was kind of out there at the time. And looking back at what we stood for, I can definitely say I'm not apologizing for any of it. I know that it was biblical truth. I know it changed lives, and it still can.
This aspect of our life of standing for unpopular things is something that neither of us would have chosen. I mean, there is nothing in either of us that just gravitates towards that sort of thing. It's not like we have a personality type that's like, oh yeah, I'd love to do that. I'd love to stick my finger in someone's eye. It's just not how either of us are wired. And yet God has called us in the direction of like, Eric and Leslie, will you stand for me on this? And like, oh God, please assign someone else. I go all the way back to a key defining moment. Like we talked about that one church where we first spoke. That was a key defining moment. In my life personally, a key defining moment before we were married is I was on a missionary team and we were on a bus traveling to Monroe, Louisiana. And this group they turned around in their seats, and there was just like a clump of about 10 of them that were talking to each other about relationships, about future marriage, and just that whole topic that young people that are single love to talk about. And I was on the outskirts of it. I wasn't participating in the conversation, and my silence, I think, intrigued some people in the group. And so at a certain point they said, so Eric, what do you think? And I mean, this is not the defining moment that I'm saying, but this was, this definitely triggered the defining moment. I made a statement that I said, well, it might sound strange, but I actually love my wife even now before I meet her. And sort of the leader of this little 10-person contingent made a statement in front of everyone. It's like, that's ridiculous. You can't love someone before you meet them. And I'm thinking, well, that's strange because I do. But this created a little kerfuffle, and that was all I said, and we left it at that. But, I got some funny looks at that point. And later that night, we arrive in Monroe, Louisiana, and there's this youth rally that is taking place there that night. And it's a pretty large crowd. I'm going to say somewhere between like 700, 800 kids that are there. And the leader of the group knows that we've shown up. They don't have anyone really to speak to this group. They have a passion to speak on purity. And so they ask our team leader, it's like, do you have anyone on your team that can speak on purity? And he's like, I don't know. And then someone who was in that little 10-group contingent on the bus says, hey, Eric Ludy has something to say about that. And so the next thing you know, he's like, yeah, okay, we'll have Eric speak tonight. And so I get told, that I'm speaking that night on purity. Okay, now this is a rather odd moment in my life, because even when I was approached by it, it's like the Spirit of God said, even as they were asking, so because I could easily have said, you've got to be kidding. There is no way I'm going to do that. Instead, the Spirit of God was like working in me to the point where I was like, I know exactly what I'm supposed to say. And I know it's not going to go over well. That's an uncomfortable sensation, by the way. I'm a guy who can read an audience. That's one of my superpowers, is I know what an audience is thinking. I know what they're feeling. And that's a hard superpower to have when you know God wants you to give things that they're not going to want. And I knew what I needed to share. And I remember just sitting in my chair that night, right before they introduced me. I'm like, dear Lord, give me something else to share. Give me something else to share. Please let me off the hook. Finally, right before I go up, I submit. I surrender to Jesus. And I'm like, okay, I'm willing to say this. I just need you to go with me. So I get up onto that stage, trembling. I'm sure I didn't sound very great in my communication style. Not one person, no one laughed, no one moved. You'd hear that random cough in the audience, like, and it was so silent as I was talking. And I'm sure I fumbled my way through it, but I was saying, most of us, we've all grown up in a generation where everyone emphasizes external purity and they talk about having an abstinence commitment. And I feel like God wants us to know that he cares about what we're thinking. He cares about what's going on in our heart, and he wants to bring purity there. And he's not just looking for physical virgins, he's looking for spiritual ones that are actually washed and cleansed on the inside and that take it seriously like he does. Now, what I'm even saying, in that, like to us just sounds normal because we literally traveled the world and spoke that for years. But at the time, it was so foreign. And I felt it being rejected even as I was sharing it. And I remember I got done, no one clapped. I went back and sat down in my seat. And the person following me, some leader gets up after me and is like, sort of, oh, yeah, well, hey, everyone, I'm not here to preach holiness. And it was like I felt the mockery. I felt the dimming of everything I just said. And my team, after this, is going to confront me. They're going to send a guy to me and say, you need to ask forgiveness from the team for misrepresenting us tonight. So the question is, and I think this is one of the key points that we wanted to draw out of our 30 years, should we apologize when we stand on the truth? Even if it's uncomfortable for people, even if it makes them wriggle in their seat, should we apologize? Now, one of the key things is it depends on how we're delivering it. If what we're delivering is cocky, arrogant, if it's demeaning, absolutely. You cannot, even if you're carrying the truth, if you carry it wrongly, you're responsible for carrying it wrongly. You need to make that right. But if you carry it in love, with a desire to please your Lord to the best that you know how, there's nothing to apologize for. And I would say that night when I said, no, I can't apologize. I can't apologize for this. It's like literally, if you think about how God is going to use us throughout our life and our ministry, it's like that's a starting point. It's almost like the gun goes off and I started running in this direction. And it's a hard direction. It's not the easy way to go.
Mm-hmm. I think it's so critical to be humble and have the goal be, we just want people to see Jesus through us. Right. But if that is our goal as Christians, is to showcase Jesus, to get out of the way so that he would be seen, and to stand for uncompromising truth, scriptural truth, we need more Christians who will stand unapologetically on truth, the truth of God's word, the truth that can set free. Of course, like Eric just said, not in a cocky, arrogant way, like I have it all figured out, but in the way that says, this is the truth that can set free, and I'm standing here. And that is really, God has always put us in situations where we've had to stand boldly for truth, even when it wasn't popular. Yeah. And so in this time when Josh Harris was doing his thing and all these people were, throwing purity under the bus and the purity movement is so terrible and all these things, we actually stood up and tried to speak some biblical sense into what was going on, and had so many people just respond with like, thank you for bringing clarity. Thank you for bringing truth. Thank you for speaking straight in the midst of all this confusion. And sometimes there were people who God had done something beautiful in their marriage and kids, and they were teaching these principles to their kids, and they were like, what, is purity suddenly bad? Like, should I not teach my kids about purity? And when we came back and stood unapologetically on this message of biblical purity, they were so strengthened and refreshed. So we saw God kind of bring us back onto the scene. That was a number of years ago, but just to speak truth into a situation that was causing a lot of confusion. And this topic of purity in relationships is not necessarily what we focus on anymore in our ministry. So the fact that we're starting out this podcast series with this is a little unusual, because it's really not. I know people think, oh, they're the When God Writes Your Love Story people. They just think about this all day long. They talk about this all day long. We really don't. That is not our emphasis at all. It is a very important area, though, absolutely, for people's lives. And it is how God started us in ministry, and it is we learned so many spiritual lessons through standing unapologetically for his truth in this area. And we still stand right there.
Well, it has been an extraordinary 30 years of life that we have shared together. So many blessings amidst so many battles. And I think it's going to be fun. I mean, this is our starter package. We've never done this. This isn't the normal style of communication that we have. But I'm looking forward to just sort of exploring this with you. And I think it's going to be really neat if you just think about it. If we keep doing this and we just sort of unpack these 30 years as even a gift for our kids to just know and to understand more of the depth and the nuance of what has made our family what it is, what has made our ministry what it is. And so it'll be fun to explore those things and discuss those things together. And so I'm just excited to see what God has in store. But meanwhile, I think for us just to remember, God has been good. He's been faithful. And as we've stood for him, the enemy's tried to knock us out. And the enemy has never succeeded in actually doing that, which is quite the statement. When we stand for Jesus unapologetically, he stands for us.